The rain drummed on the window panes of the artifact gallery, creating a bizarre pattern of drops and shadows. Emma Porter took one last look at the hanging paintings. The new contemporary art exhibit was due to open in 2 hours. Her small gallery on Benefit Street had earned a reputation as a place to find really interesting work by emerging artists. Should we move Azure Dream closer to the window? Lisa Chen, a curator at the Museum of Modern Art and Emma's best friend, tapped her pencil thoughtfully on her clipboard. The lighting is better there. Emma shook her head, fixing a loose strand of brown hair. No, let it stay. The contrast with Autumn Waltz sets the right mood. At 28, she'd already been running the gallery she'd inherited from her uncle for 5 years. The small space in a historic building became her second home. Each exhibition required months of preparation, endless meetings with artists, negotiations with collectors. But tonight promised to be special. For the first time, Artifact was presenting the works of a really famous artist. The first guests began to arrive at 7 sharp. Emma, dressed in an elegant black dress, met them at the entrance, handing out smiles and exhibition catalogs. The hall gradually filled with soft conversations, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the distinctive rustle of expensive clothes. She spotted him near Azure Dream. A tall man in an impeccably cut gray suit was scrutinizing a painting. Something in his posture, in the way he tilted his head slightly, betrayed genuine interest. Emma walked toward him, noting the stranger's correct facial features and confident posture as she went. "Interesting work, isn't it?" she said, stopping beside him. He turned around, and Emma met the attentive gaze of gray eyes. "James Holbrook," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "It's been a long time since I've seen anything so impressive." Emma Porter, gallery owner. His handshake was firm and confident. They spent the next half hour discussing contemporary art, and Emma was surprised to discover that James had an excellent knowledge of painting. He told her that he worked as an investment banker, but collecting paintings was his longtime hobby. By the end of the evening, Azure Dream was sold, and Emma agreed to dinner the following Friday. Lisa, who had been watching their conversation from afar, raised an eyebrow meaningfully when James finally said goodbye. "Do you know who it was?" she asked, as soon as the door closed behind the last guest. "The Holbrooks are one of the most powerful families in Providence. His father, Robert Holbrook, practically runs half the city's financial sector." Emma shrugged, but something inside her trembled. She was used to dealing with wealthy clients, but the Holbrooks were on a different level. Old money, impeccable reputation, closed social circle. The next weeks passed like a blur. James proved to be an attentive and witty conversationalist. They dined at the best restaurants in the city, attended private exhibitions, concerts at the historic Philharmonic. Emma gradually immersed herself in the world of Providence high society, where everyone knew each other, where every gesture mattered, and reputation was valued above money. She met the Holbrook family at a traditional Sunday lunch at their mansion in the East Side neighborhood. The Victorian mansion was breathtaking in its grandeur. Antique furniture, heavy-framed paintings, impeccably polished silverware. Maria Santos, the housekeeper, glided silently between rooms, keeping order. Robert Holbrook, a tall, gray-haired man with a commanding gaze, greeted Emma with restrained warmth. In his office, Emma noticed several works by artists exhibiting in her gallery. Over lunch, the conversation flowed smoothly from art to finances, from city news to future plans. Later, strolling through the garden, James talked about his childhood in this house, his father's strict rules, and the high expectations placed on the sole heir. Emma caught a hint of something akin to bitterness in his voice, but the moment was too brief to give it importance. Spring in Providence had been unusually warm. The gallery was thriving, and new exhibitions were attracting more visitors. Emma couldn't help but notice the change in attitude in certain circles since she'd started showing up with James. Doors that had been closed were now swinging open, and invitations to private events were pouring in one after another. Lisa often teased her friend, calling her a modern art Cinderella, but there was some truth to her jokes. The world Emma was entering was beautiful and dangerous at the same time, like an expensive wine, tart, with a rich aftertaste and hidden bitterness. April Providence was drenched in blooming magnolias. Emma and James often walked the ancient streets, where each house held its own story. After that memorable evening at the gallery, their meetings became regular. First it was business lunches under the pretext of discussing art, then leisurely walks along the river, and then romantic dinners in restaurants where ordinary people couldn't get in. James turned out to be an amazing conversationalist. He talked about the architecture of Europe, where he often visited for work, shared stories about rare paintings and their creators, but never talked about his work in detail. "Finance is a boring matter," he joked, shifting the conversation to other topics. One evening they lingered in a small jazz club. The sounds of saxophone floated over the tables, and expensive wine sparkled in the glass. "You know," James said suddenly, "I've never met anyone like you. You're real." There was a strange note in his voice, as if that definition had a special meaning. Emma hadn't thought much of it at the time, mesmerized by the warmth of his gaze. Their first kiss had happened at the gallery door, after the closing of an exhibition. It was raining lightly, and the water droplets glistened like tiny diamonds in the light of the lanterns. James slipped his jacket over her shoulders, and somehow that simple gesture seemed more intimate than all the expensive gifts he'd begun to spoil her with. And the gifts were luxurious: antique art books, rare graphic artwork, fine jewelry. "You deserve the best," he said, accepting no objections. Lisa only shook her head. "Is he trying to buy the whole gallery piece by piece?" Spring flew by unnoticed. They attended private auctions, where James confidently bid on paintings without even consulting the catalog. They were at charity parties, where Emma gradually got acquainted with the Holbrooks' social circle. Some looked at her with ill-concealed disdain. The owner of a small gallery seemed to them not a couple of sufficient status for the heir of such a family. But James didn't seem to notice it. He proudly presented Emma as an expert on modern art, emphasizing her professionalism and fine taste. At such moments, she saw how the attitude of others changed from disdain to respectful interest. Once they spent a whole day in Boston, wandering through museums and antique shops. In a small restaurant in the Italian Quarter, James suddenly became serious. "I want you to know that my family, our business, it's a complex system. Sometimes you have to make some tough decisions." "What are you talking about?" Emma asked. "Just, trust me, okay?" He took her hand, and the gesture seemed almost pleading. That night they stayed together for the first time. James's apartment was unexpectedly modest for a man of his position. Minimalist interior, lots of books, a few really nice paintings on the walls. "I can be myself here," he said. And again there was something more than a simple explanation in his words. During the night, Emma woke up to the sound of his voice. James was on the phone in the next room in an unfamiliar language, German, I think. The voice sounded strained, even angry. She didn't ask about it in the morning. Something told her there were questions better left unasked. Their relationship was developing rapidly, as if both of them felt time slipping away like sand through their fingers. James talked more and more about the future, about plans to expand the gallery, to create an entire chain. "We could build something special," he would say, and his eyes would light up with a strange fire. In early May, he took her to meet his father. So began a new chapter in their story, where the first bells of impending tragedy were already beginning to sound, though no one wanted to hear them yet. For now, they were just a couple in love, strolling through the blossoming city. James bought bouquets of white roses for Emma. "They remind me of your sincerity," he said. Much later, she would realize the bitter irony of those words. But then, in those spring days, everything seemed beautiful and right, like a painting that had just come out from under the brush of a master. Only sometimes, catching James's reflection in the gallery windows, did Emma notice a shadow flicker across his face, like a crack in a flawless canvas, a foreshadowing of future destruction. James proposed in Providence's oldest park, under the shade of century-old maples. The sapphire ring, the Holbrook family jewel, felt unexpectedly heavy on Emma's finger. The engagement was celebrated at the country club, a private event for a select few, where champagne flowed and congratulations were heard in 4 languages. Preparations for the wedding began immediately. Robert Holbrook insisted on holding the ceremony at the family mansion, and the reception was planned with a scale worthy of his position. Emma often felt more like a spectator than a protagonist. A team of organizers, florists, decorators appeared and disappeared, obeying the instructions of the future father-in-law. Emma noticed the first signs that all was not smooth in the Holbrook family at the next Sunday dinner. James and his father were alone in the study, where muffled but clearly irritated voices were heard. Maria Santos, arranging the cutlery, cast anxious glances at the closed door. "Senor James has been very nervous lately," she said quietly when they were alone. "Just like a year ago when—" The housekeeper paused and hurried out of the room. A year ago. Emma remembered that it had been then that James's partner, Thomas Gray, had suddenly left the company. There had been some press coverage of the disagreement over strategy, but no official comment. Tensions were building gradually, like a coming thunderstorm. James was increasingly late for work. His phone was ringing constantly, but he only talked when he was alone. One evening, when they were discussing the guest list, the call made him go pale. Apologizing, he went out onto the terrace. "I told you not to call that number," Emma heard bits and pieces of the conversation. "No, that's out of the question. I'll find a way." 3 weeks before the wedding, Thomas Gray walked into the gallery. Tall, trim, in an expensive but carelessly unbuttoned coat, he took a long look at the new exposition. "It's a beautiful gallery," he remarked when Emma came up to greet him. "Now I can see why James was so interested in this place." There was an unpleasant undertone to his words. As he left a business card. "You might want to know more about your fiancé's business, especially about his artistic side." That evening, Emma noticed James looking through some papers in his home office. Hearing her footsteps, he hastily put the papers away in the safe. The only thing left on the desk was an envelope with her gallery's logo on it. "They're just work materials, darling," he smiled, but it was a strained smile. "I want to give you a wedding present, to expand the gallery, to create a network." Robert Holbrook also changed. His usual imperiousness was replaced by a kind of nervous determination. He locked himself and his son in his study for long periods of time, and one day Emma overheard the end of their conversation. "Do you realize you've jeopardized everything I've spent decades building?" Robert's voice shook with barely contained rage. "I will not allow—" The door slammed shut, cutting off the phrase. A week before the wedding, James didn't show up for the traditional Sunday lunch, citing urgent business. Emma sat at the huge table across from her future father-in-law, uncomfortable under his gaze. "You know, Emma," Robert said abruptly, "in our family, we value tradition and reputation above all else. Sometimes we have to make difficult decisions to preserve them." That evening, when Emma returned home, she found a message from an unknown number on her answering machine. A man's voice, distorted by static, said, "Ask your fiancé about the gallery in Zurich, and about what happened to the real paintings." James didn't answer the phone until late that night. When he finally showed up, he smelled of whiskey and panic in his eyes. He stood at the window for a long time, staring out at the lights of the city. "It'll get better," he said without turning around. "It's just a little while longer. After the wedding, I'll fix everything." But Emma could see his hands trembling when he lit a cigarette, a habit he'd kicked years ago. The wedding was approaching, and with it a sense of impending disaster. It was as if everyone involved in this drama knew something important that they kept silent, afraid to say out loud. Maria Santos furtively crossed herself as she passed Robert's office. There were rumors in town about major problems in the Holbrooks business, and James was becoming more and more aloof, as if preparing for something inevitable. The day before the wedding, Emma found a crumpled envelope in his jacket pocket. Inside was a ticket to Zurich for the following week, and a note written in Thomas Gray's familiar handwriting. "Last chance to make things right. Otherwise, they'll know the truth." The morning of the wedding was overcast. Heavy clouds hung over Providence as if to portend bad things. The Holbrook mansion was bustling with activity as the florists finished decorating the rooms. The waiters arranged the champagne glasses, and the aroma of fresh-baked goods from the kitchen wafted through the air. Emma sat in front of the mirror in the guest bedroom while the makeup artist worked on her makeup. Lisa was fussing over her dress, a classic gown from a famous designer, with a long train and vintage lace. In this pastel-colored room, time seemed to slow down. "Have you seen James?" Emma asked when they were alone. "He's in the West Wing with his father," Lisa said. "He looks tense." Emma remembered last night, their last conversation before the wedding. James had been strangely silent, then suddenly said, "Whatever happens, know that I really loved you." The past tense in his phrase scratched her ears, but she chalked it up to pre-wedding excitement. There was a quiet knock at the door. It was Maria with a cup of tea. The old housekeeper looked worried. "Señorita Emma, maybe we should postpone." She spoke almost in a whisper. "I saw a bad sign." She had no time to finish. Quick footsteps were heard in the corridor, and Maria hurried away. Robert Holbrook entered the room, impeccable in a tuxedo from the best tailor in town. "The cars are ready," he announced. "It's time to go to church." The ancient Holy Trinity Church greeted the guests with majestic silence and coolness. The sunlight shining through the stained glass windows created a whimsical play of light. Emma was standing in the small bridal room when she heard some noise from the vestry. Muffled voices, the sound of falling. But when she looked out into the hallway, there was no one there. The ceremony had started at noon exactly. James was waiting at the altar, pale but focused. Only a keen observer would have noticed his fingers twitching. Robert Holbrook sat in the front row, glancing at his watch from time to time. When the priest was saying the traditional words of eternal love and fidelity, somewhere in the back of the church a door creaked open. Emma saw James flinch, but the moment was too solemn to be distracted. The reception began at 3 in the afternoon. The guests, the cream of Providence Society, and the Holbrook family's business associates filled the spacious halls of the mansion. Waiters glided between the groups of guests with trays of champagne and gourmet hors d'oeuvre. The orchestra played classical tunes. The first alarm bell rang during the traditional dance of the newlyweds. James stopped suddenly in the middle of the waltz, seeing someone in the crowd of guests. Emma followed his gaze and spotted Thomas Gray, who discreetly showed James some envelope and headed for the garden exit. "I'm sorry, I need to—" James didn't finish the sentence, gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, and disappeared into the crowd. Emma spent the next hour accepting congratulations, smiling and thanking the guests, but there was a growing unease inside. James wasn't coming back. Robert Holbrook had disappeared somewhere too. Lisa, noticing her friend's anxiety, tried to distract her with conversation, but then a pale Maria came to them. "Señora, wine, for the main toast," she stammered. "It's not in the cellar where it's always kept." "I'll check it myself," Emma volunteered, glad for the distraction. The wine cellar was in the basement of the mansion, a maze of ancient bottle racks. Emma was descending the stone steps when she heard a strange sound, like something dripping onto the floor. The lights came on in sections. The first room was empty, the second room was empty, the third— Emma's scream echoed through the basement. James was lying on the floor between the shelves in a puddle of dark red liquid that, on closer inspection, turned out not to be wine. Nearby was a broken bottle of Chateau Margaux 1982, the pride of the Holbrook collection. The sound of heels on the stone floor. It was Lisa running to scream. Then the stomping of many feet, guards, guests, staff. Someone called the police. Someone was trying to pull Emma away from her husband's body. Through the shroud of shock, she saw Robert Holbrook appear at the cellar door, his face unnaturally calm, with only a tiny red spot on the cuff of his snow-white shirt. An hour later, the mansion was flooded with police officers. The guests were asked to remain where they were to give statements. Thomas Gray was nowhere to be found, and in James' tuxedo pocket they found a note written in familiar handwriting. "This ends tonight, one way or another." By late afternoon, the rain had fallen, washing away the traces of the wedding party. The white roses in the bride's bouquet began to crumble, and water droplets glistened on their petals like tears. Emma's wedding dress, splattered with wine and blood, lay in a crumpled heap in the corner of the guest bedroom. Somewhere in the house, the first witnesses began to be questioned, and in the wine cellar, Forensic investigators searched for clues that might shed light on why a day that began with wedding bells ended with funeral bells. Detectives Sarah Ramirez and Michael O'Neill arrived at the Holbrook mansion as the forensics team was finishing up their work in the wine cellar. Ramirez, a short woman with a tenacious gaze and early gray in her dark hair, immediately took charge of the investigation. O'Neill, her partner of many years, began by examining the crime scene. The blow was caused by a wine bottle, the medical examiner stated. Death occurred between 16:30 and 17 hours. There were virtually no signs of struggle. The victim knew her attacker and didn't expect the blow. Emma was the first to be interviewed. She was sitting in the library in her robe, her mascara smeared with tears. The story was confusing. James's strange behavior in recent weeks, the mysterious phone calls, the appearance of Thomas Gray. "Tell me about the note you found yesterday," Ramirez asked. Emma pulled from her purse a crumpled envelope containing a ticket to Zurich. O'Neill made a note in his notebook: "Check Swiss connections." Robert Holbrook's interrogation was taking place in his office. The stain on his cuff, as it turned out, was from red wine. He had helped clean up a broken bottle in the banquet hall an hour before the murder. 3 waiters confirmed his alibi. My son had been troubled. Holbrook Sr. was careful with his words. There were some business difficulties. What kind of difficulties? O'Neill clarified. Confidential information. I'm prepared to discuss it only in the presence of a lawyer. Maria Santos was more talkative. Having worked in the house for 20 years, she knew all the family's secrets. A year ago, when Senior Gray left the company, there were very loud fights here, she said. And then the strange visitors started. They would come late at night, speaking different languages. Senior James was always drinking after these meetings. The trace of Thomas Gray was found in a local hotel. He checked out an hour before the murder. In his room, they found a folder with documents relating to a network of European galleries. Most of the papers were in German. The breakthrough in the investigation came on the 3rd day. O'Neill, checking the financial operations of the Holbrooks company, discovered a series of suspicious transactions through art galleries in Switzerland. The amounts were huge, and the paintings appearing in the documents seemed grossly overvalued. It's a classic money laundering scheme, Ramirez explained, looking at the diagram on the blackboard. Buying art at inflated prices, reselling it through fake galleries. But something went wrong. Lisa Chen, the museum's curator, helped unravel the art part of the scheme. Some of the paintings sold through the Holbrook galleries turned out to be high-quality fakes. The originals had disappeared to an unknown destination. I began to suspect something was wrong when James took an interest in Emma's gallery, she admitted. He was pushing too hard to expand the business. They found encrypted correspondence with Gray on James's computer. The last message was sent the morning of the wedding. Either you return my share or I reveal the whole scheme. You have until tonight. New details surfaced one by one. It turned out that Gray hadn't just left the company a year ago. He'd been forced out when he started asking too many questions about European operations. But he was left with evidence of fraud. Interviews with bank officials revealed a complex web of financial transactions. Robert Holbrook had spent years building a respectable facade behind which the criminal scheme was hidden. James was a key figure in this operation. It was through him past all contacts with the galleries. But why now? Ramirez pondered, reviewing the witness statements. What had changed? The answer was found in a small safe in James's office. Among the documents was a letter from a Swiss bank, notifying him of an internal investigation into suspicious transactions. The date of the audit was set for the week after the wedding. O'Neill put together a timeline of events. 1 year ago, conflict with Gray and his departure from the company. 3 months ago, the start of the audit at the Swiss bank. 1 month ago, first blackmail by Gray. 1 week before the wedding, intense negotiations and threats. Wedding day, final ultimatum and murder. The big question remained: who had struck the fatal blow? Gray had a motive, revenge and money, but Robert Holbrook could also go to extreme lengths to protect the family business. Emma was an innocent pawn in this game, her gallery just a cover for future operations. The clue came unexpectedly. A voicemail recorded an hour before his death was found on James's cell phone. "Father, I'll tell you everything. I can't let Emma get dragged into this. It's better to let it end now." The detectives looked at each other. A picture was beginning to emerge. Now all that was left was to find the last piece of evidence to back up their theory, and they knew exactly where to look. In the Providence Police Department Chief's office, Sarah Ramirez was organizing the last of the photos on the board. The 2-week investigation was coming to an end, and the crime scene was finally coming into focus. Let's go over all the details one more time. O'Neill laid out the file folders on the table. We need to be sure. The story they had reconstructed began long before the tragic wedding. Robert Holbrook, a respected financier and head of the family business, had spent years building a complex scheme to launder money through a network of art galleries. The main flow was through Switzerland, where bank secrecy laws helped hide the true origin of the funds. James, raised in the spirit of family tradition, became a key figure in the scheme. His official job at an investment bank served as a cover for darker operations. He coordinated the purchase and sale of paintings, many of which turned out to be elaborate forgeries. This is where Thomas Gray's role comes in. Ramirez pointed to a photograph of James's former partner. He was in charge of the European part of the operation until he started asking uncomfortable questions. A year ago, Gray discovered that some of the paintings coming through their galleries were disappearing and being replaced by copies. The forgeries were so good that only experts could recognize the deception. When he began his own investigation, Robert Holbrook orchestrated his dismissal using trumped-up charges of embezzlement. But Gray had time to gather evidence, O'Neill continued, and he was waiting for the right moment to retaliate. That moment came when the Swiss bank launched an internal investigation into suspicious transactions. Gray, who had connections in banking circles, was the first to know about it and began blackmailing James. Now here's the best part. Ramirez pulled out the bank statements. Nearly $10 million had been withdrawn from the company's accounts the week before the wedding. The money had been transferred to Zurich. Further events unfolded rapidly. James, cornered by Gray's blackmail and the upcoming audit, began to prepare avenues of retreat. The ticket to Switzerland that Emma had found was part of that plan. But there was something neither Gray nor James had considered. O'Neill showed the email printout. Robert Holbrook was monitoring the situation too, and he wasn't about to let his son ruin everything. On the day of the wedding, Gray showed up at the mansion with one last ultimatum. The meeting in the wine cellar was set for the time of the wedding waltz. James went down there, hoping to make an arrangement, but met more than just Gray there. Forensics reconstructed the crime scene. Robert Holbrook, who was watching his son, overheard their conversation. When James announced that he was going to confess to everything and protect Emma from participating in the criminal scheme, his father made a decision. The bottle was hit from behind. Ramirez showed photos of the crime scene. James didn't even have time to turn around. Gray had already left the cellar through the back door that led to the garden. We found his footprints in the wet ground. Robert Holbrook acted in cold blood. He went back to the reception, sat for the allotted time to create an alibi, and only then organized the accidental discovery of the body. And here's the final piece of evidence. O'Neill laid the forensic report on the table. They found microscopic traces of blood on the bottle shards, not only from James, but also from his killer. Robert had cut himself when he struck the blow. The denouement came quickly. When the police came to arrest Robert Holbrook, he met them in his office, calmly finishing his whiskey from an antique crystal glass. "You don't understand," he told the detectives. "I wasn't protecting money. I was protecting the legacy of 5 generations of Holbrooks. James was going to ruin everything because of some gallery owner." The epilogue was unexpected. Thomas Gray showed up a week after Holbrook's arrest. He surrendered to the authorities and agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. It turned out that the originals of the stolen paintings were stored in a special vault in Zurich. Emma received a letter from James's lawyers. It turned out that he had rewritten his will the day before the wedding, leaving her a significant portion of his legal estate. Attached to the letter was a note. "I'm sorry I didn't have time to tell you the truth. I really loved you and didn't want to drag you into this mess." Robert Holbrook was sentenced to life in prison. The Holbrooks' financial empire collapsed when the full details of their criminal activities came to light. Sarah Ramirez closed the last folder of documents. Outside the window, it was beginning to rain, just like it had on that wedding day when the bells of Holy Trinity Church rang for James Holbrook one last time. "Do you know what the strangest thing is?" she said to O'Neill. "If James hadn't fallen in love with Emma, if he hadn't wanted to protect her, things could have gone on for years to come." O'Neill nodded as he gathered his things. Sometimes love destroys empires better than any betrayal. That evening, Emma stood at the window of her gallery looking out at the rain. As Your Dream, the painting that started this story, still hung on the wall. She knew now that it was one of the few original works in the Holbrooks collection. Perhaps that was why James had stood in front of her for so long that first night, admiring a rare glimpse of truth in a world built on lies.